As any magician or illusionist will tell you, the human senses aren't hard to trick. Through diversions and sleight of hand, it's pretty easy to make people see things that aren't there. In today's world, technology is magic, and VR takes the cake. As soon as you put on that headset, you feel totally transported into another world. But how can a screen, remote, and a headset create an entire virtual world all on their own? Watch this video to find out. Hello everyone, and welcome to another Fireside Chat. Today, before we dive back into VR games this Friday, we're taking a look at the science behind what VR does to your brain. As you may remember from our last VR stream, we talked about how it only tricks 2.5 of your senses, but still manages to fully immerse you in the game world. In order to do this, VR fools many different parts of your brain, from memory to depth perception and even balance. So while only your vision, hearing, and a little bit of your sense of touch are stimulated, the brain fills in the gaps to make you feel truly lost in the mythical world of virtual reality. So, while the creators of VR are definitely due a ton of credit for their awesome invention, the player's brain does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to the illusion. First, let's establish an understanding of how a VR headset works. Of course, as the name implies, it is indeed a head-mounted display, or HMD for short. For our purposes here, we're specifically talking about VR gear like the Oculus Rift, which utilize a computer, rather than things like the Google Daydream, which work in an entirely different way. The basic premise of the entire setup is that, through use of HDMI, the image from the computer screen is displayed in 2 lenses in the headset, one for each eye. This creates something known as stereoscopic display. This means that each of the 2D images is angled to mimic the way that our 2 eyes see things at slightly different angles. Herein lies the key to creating an immersive environment, mimicking how things behave in real life. Creating an illusion accurate to how our eyes see the real world is only the first step. Through 3 different types of movement tracking, head tracking, motion tracking, and eye tracking, VR can create a very realistic picture. Head tracking is the most vital to VR. Utilizing headwear such as a gyroscope, accelerometer, and magnetometer, and sometimes even LEDs and an external camera, the headset is able to track where your head is looking, as to appropriately change the virtual reality point of view to match that. This requires an unbelievably low amount of lag, less than 50 milliseconds, otherwise your brain will realize something's up. This leads into another very important aspect of VR, 6 degrees of freedom. This is the principle that you can move your head, and therefore your point of view, in 6 different ways. This includes the X, Y, and Z axis, as well as 3 different directions of rotation. More specifically, you have heave, which is straight up and down, surge, which is forwards and backwards, and sway, which is strafing left and strafing right. That's for the X, Y, and Z axis. Now for rotations, you have roll, which is tilting side to side, pitch, which is tilting forward and backwards, and yaw, which is turning left and turning right. These 6 different ways to move make head tracking a very immersive concept on its own, so wait until you see what else VR has to offer. Beside head tracking, the VR headset immerses you in a variety of ways, like motion tracking. While some VR headsets achieve this through sensors like Xbox's Kinect, the best form of this is controllers like the Oculus Touch. These work by having a variety of buttons, which are placed in a way where you can squeeze and press them to make your hand roughly mimic what it's doing in real life. These use sensors that you place throughout the room, and while this limits your play area, sometimes even to a measly 25 square feet, they greatly add to the experience. This is another sense being tricked too. Through controller vibrations, there is some appeal to the sense of touch, which is where the 1/2 of the 2.5 senses comes into play. While smart gloves are a more optimal version of this concept, they're not as widely on the market and don't offer vibrations like the controllers do. The last form of movement tracking is not widely used. In fact, it's only present in one unreleased VR device. Nonetheless, it's worth noting as it ups the experience a lot. This tracking is, of course, eye tracking. This would constitute infrared scanners scanning the direction your eye is looking and changing the focus of the screen with that. Yes, this would mean screen blurring, which in this case is a very good thing. Having the entire picture in full HD is not what the brain is used to seeing, and thus it separates the brain from the experience of VR. Plus, this unnatural lack of blurring can cause motion sickness in more susceptible players, as can incorrect head tracking or motion tracking as well. Aside from the movement trackers, headphones round out these 2.5 senses with the all-important audio stimuli. So, all of this technology comes together to make virtual reality a very realistic experience. But in what other ways does VR trick your brain? One of the main ways the brain is fooled is through memory. Being actively involved in this 360-degree environment triggers many areas of your brain involved in reading and writing memories. As they say, we remember about 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear, and 80% of what we personally experience. This comes into play here, as you're both seeing, hearing, and experiencing the gameplay while in VR. This is a huge help when it comes to the success of a VR game. If you try out a demo, or if you play VR at someone else's house, the game literally sticks in your head better than other games. I'm still thinking about how cool my VR experience was over a week later. This, of course, makes people who try out VR more likely to buy it, and therefore helps drive sales for companies like Oculus and Vive. Plus, having stronger memories of the experience helps add to the immersion, as it shows that your brain is truly soaking in the bigger picture while playing in VR. On an interesting side note, children with immensely broader imagination than adults are more susceptible to VR's illusion. For instance, while an adult may be thrilled, they know how to use the joystick to move, but a child may just take off running in the imaginary world. Just something to think about. But memory isn't the only way that VR plays with your head. As you know, VR relies primarily on visual stimuli to get the job done. This comes in many different ways, like 3D stereoscopic imagery, as we talked about earlier in the video. But what effect does this have on the brain and the eye itself? Since the eye only processes visual stimuli in depth, but provides no context or exact measurements, it's up to the brain to decide what it's looking at. This is how optical illusions work. So, VR is interpreted just as the video in the bottom right corner of the screen is being interpreted in your brain. It thinks something is there that isn't, or at least that isn't how it seems. To see how our brain responds to virtual environments, the Princeton Neuroscience Institute conducted a survey and a study which found that brain cells known as topocytes or place cells help map out our environment and trigger similarly in both real and virtual environments. This shows that through these cells, our brain analyzes a VR environment very close to the way it analyzes the real world, which is one reason that we feel so immersed in these false environments. There's one last area of the VR illusion we need to address, and that's the idea of a jump scare or surprise in VR. Christian Grillen, PhD, who studies fear and anxiety in the brain, says that, and I quote, "The best way to evoke a startle response is with a sound, but touch or flashes of light work too. A shotgun or a door slamming will make you startle, but a plane that takes off will not, because the intensity of the noise only increases gradually." These can be especially thrilling, because the immersion that VR offers makes you feel like you're actually going through the horrific events displayed in the game. As we discussed in my video on horror tropes, the suspense is everything, and VR does especially well at building up tension and suspense. The sound cue of the jump scare, combined with the visuals, create a truly gut-wrenching surprise that startles even the most avid horror fan. No matter how much you want to expect the scare, your brain has an automatic response to sudden changes, so even knowing you're going to be scared doesn't do much to relieve the fear. All in all, VR leads to a very compelling and immersive experience, with 2.5 senses being entirely involved in the process, that is, sight, hearing, and a little bit of touch. Anything from a first-person shooter to a survival horror game totally sucks you in. Head tracking, motion tracking, eye tracking, and stereoscopic imaging all come together to provide your brain and your eyes with a fake reality that behaves the same way as the real one, which is the most important part of a fully captivating virtual reality. Don't forget VR's effect on your memory. The hands-on experience of a VR game makes it stick in your head greater than other video games, and sometimes even greater than real-life experiences. This is important to keep in mind next time you're looking into purchasing a VR device on your own. While virtual reality is a truly fun and exciting form of gameplay, it is pretty pricey, so don't let the gaming industry's mind games fool you into making a decision you'll regret later. All that being said, remember, we didn't start the fire, we just keep it burning, and thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the reality behind virtual reality. I wasn't lying when I said that VR truly is a wonderful platform. As you may have seen, I really enjoyed my time spent with VR on the recent live stream. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Speaking of, we're going to be back with more VR this Friday, so don't miss out. If you have gotten to experience VR, let us know in the comments section your favorite virtual experience or game, and leave a like or subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching.